Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores life in the cottage at Woodland Corners. I wasn't sure I was going to put out an episode this week. I have a few irons in the fire, but nothing close to a release. Sometimes, though, material just hands itself to me. An episode writes itself. The last few days, that's what happened. Someone who's been on my Facebook friends list for a lot of years unfriended me recently, and I can't blame them. In all the time I've had them on my wall, I can't recall them ever having changed a single view or commenting to say they've learned anything there. I'm not just talking about learning from me, because that's really not what my wall is about. I learn from the people on my wall. And most of what I share that's relevant or insightful isn't original material, but bits and pieces that I've gleaned from other wiser people and communities. I try to be clear that the information isn't original, and I make it a point on my account to tell people to listen and learn from everyone there who represents perspectives we don't often hear. People who are denied a platform in our society, but who are greatly impacted by it. I can't tell you how often someone reaches out to me in a PM to say that person X or person Y on my friends list has taught them so much, or that the connections they've made have really opened avenues for better understanding. It's a rich community full of teachers, if only someone has a desire to learn. In the Bible, there's an analogy used of giving fine pearls to swine. While I certainly don't endorse dehumanizing labels, I do get the point of the lesson. It's trying to say that there are people who simply cannot appreciate learning, people who have no desire to expand their horizons, to consider self-improvement, to expend any effort toward their own social education. And when I say effort, I mean even so much as to consume material when someone isn't even asking them to do the work, but is willing to spoon-feed them. It's like walking down a street with $100 bills on the ground all around you, and feeling like it's just too much trouble to pick them up. It's no mystery why someone is like this, though. The information they would gain would require them to adjust their thinking and their attitudes, and possibly even their behavior. And in the end, it wouldn't actually hand them any immediate gains. They'd be informed enough to do less harm to others in the world, but in their own day-to-day experience, they'd see little difference. They wouldn't earn more money or live in a more comfortable house. They might even see some losses if they decide, for example, to financially support causes to further the goals of marginalized communities instead of investing in themselves or causes that primarily benefit them at the expense of others. This week, U.S. Supreme Court Judge Stephen Breyer announced his retirement. This means that President Biden now has an opportunity to appoint a new SCOTUS judge who could potentially be very left-leaning. The GOP under the last president shoved through a number of judges without a majority of votes. And there is no reason to waste too much time trying to court bipartisan approval for a judge almost no GOP members will endorse. This means we don't even have to worry about seeking out what we laughably label a moderate in the US, because the right wing, which has gone full bigot in the last several years, isn't even close to half the country in polling. They are simply a squeaky wheel demanding all the oil. They have sufficiently shuttered the vote to the point that their votes matter. And in the event they lose, they've loaded our courts and gone after local elections that many citizens ignore in order to ensure some foothold. This could result in them gaining seats in the next election, and I fear for the 2024 presidency because I don't see any candidates being floated to challenge them. Of course, I'm assuming that Biden won't go for a second term, as that was never the intent. He offered to try and hold the line for the nation, but the expectation was not that he'd be doing it for 8 years. But all that is another matter for another day and not what I'm interested in talking about in the here and now. Here and now, we have a slot for a new judge. It won't impact the conservative majority balance of the courts, but it's still an opportunity in many ways. And in what is probably the most significant way, it's a chance to install more much-needed diversity and representation on the court. It's important to note, for folks outside the US, that the black vote was heavily courted in 2016. There was a lot of white support for movements like BLM. There was a different feel and a lot of momentum, and people were hopeful. I follow an account called Relentless Indigenous Woman. I saw her share out a TikTok video from another account that goes by, and I'll have to spell this because I can't pronounce it, QILANDRES. AKVLAQS. The video talks about an invitation that was received in their comments to join a comprehensive movement to push for more freedom for all nations. However, the host of the account asks, why now? She notes how very ignored Indigenous issues are, and why suddenly she's being invited to support a broader movement to benefit others, when so often no one shows up to support her community. It's fair to ask, why should I show up and support you if you aren't going to show up and support me? It's fair to ask, how do you know this movement is actually going to benefit me and my community when you historically have not even cared enough about me and my community to learn what our problems are? If you can't be bothered to even try to understand our issues, why should I trust you to offer me a solution? Is this event truly going to help me, or is it something that helps you, and you're handing me your pitch to gain my support for goals that primarily help you? I have noted before that the benefit of Biden wasn't that he was himself so open-minded and informed on issues of social justice, but rather that he wasn't afraid to surround himself with those who are better representatives, who are in diverse demographics unlike his own, who do have insight and access to communities he doesn't actually understand. His administration is making good when it comes to appointing diverse candidates for power positions within the administration, and that's something we would not have seen under Trump. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Trump won't appoint someone from a marginalized community, but when he does, he's very careful to choose someone from the community who will support the goals of the dominant culture, his own demographic and that of our founders, the older, wealthy, cishet white male identity. It's unlikely, for example, that Trump would have chosen a running mate who openly called him out for his racism on the debate stage and who never backed off that position. Trump did surround himself with people who had previously been detractors, but only after they'd sufficiently sucked up in a highly public way. As a woman who has mainly seen elections that have offered me white male candidate A versus white male candidate B with a different perspective, it becomes tiring. It angers me that the nation was set up in such a way that hundreds of years later, we're still seeing this stranglehold on power that our founders wanted to ensure. I guess it's a testament to how well they crafted our nation's foundations to ensure continued bigotry and narrow representation. I almost feel a sense of respect in the way evil genius still notes that a plan is genius. Evil goals, yes, but I sure can't say it hasn't worked to safeguard the interests of their identities and ideological heirs centuries into the future. When I think it's withstood non-whites gaining the capacity to become citizens and therefore the capacity to vote and hold office, it's withstood women gaining the capacity to vote and hold office. But still, the society has been structured so firmly on those founding principles that it remains true today that the top tiers of all our influential power structures consist of the same demographic of people who founded the nation, to the detriment of everyone else. This is why it's imperative to have representation, especially representation that's not going to just look diverse, not just bring skin-deep diversity to the table, but will bring perspectives and ideas that challenge our social structures and systems which continue to provide inherent and unfair advantage to the people who operate in a system designed to offer them continued favoritism. Within any marginalized community, there will be a broad range of attitudes and experiences, in part because there will be a broad range of privilege. I've talked before about the fact that I enjoy a lot of privilege in the U.S. While I am a woman and confronted by social sexism, I still have a lot more privilege because I'm white, cishet, gender binary, educated, financially stable, housed, able-bodied, etc. When I talk about my own experience as a woman or represent that demographic through talking about my experiences, it's very likely I'll soft sell a lot of oppression that a lot of other women face because of my circumstance and lack of experience and understanding of those aspects that other women endure. People in marginalized communities who ask to see representation understand this. When they say they want to see representation, they aren't saying skin-deep representation, and I've addressed this idea in the past. When I had Rob Poole on, he mentioned it's not about simple proportional representation. It's about taking oppression seriously. That's why it's not just about installing tokens to say that a box has been checked. It's about installing serious candidates with a depth of understanding about the issues and the needs of their communities. I've not engaged with any marginalized group that doesn't have members it will instantly call out as examples of those within their ranks who do a shit job of representing them. People the rest of them wish would just sit down and shut up because all they seem to do is reinforce dominant culture narratives and make people in oppressive classes feel better about the oppression they support and maintain for their own advantage. The bigot narrative is that they want us to feel guilty about past wrongs we've had nothing to do with. But in fact, the goal is to simply appeal to a sense of responsibility to get us to realize our obligation to stop the oppression that these antiquated systems are perpetuating. Someone described it to me once like this. Imagine that your great-grandfather built a machine that heats your house by burning orphans and puppies as fuel. Upon his death, he wills that machine to your grandfather, who does likewise, and wills it to your father, who does likewise, and wills it to you. It's completely true that you did not dream up this horror. It's completely true you did not build this horror. But it's also completely true that if you use it to heat your house, you're choosing to keep this horror going. And that's not asking you to accept guilt for past wrongs, but to accept the responsibility and obligation that should come to you when you begin to understand exactly how your home is heated and how that benefit to you is derived from the suffering and death of others. It's up to us today to decide whether to keep that machine operational or to dismantle it. And yes, to some degree, it will depend on how we feel about it. Do we prioritize our own comfort or the cost to others in order to provide ourselves that comfort? Whether that machine stays or goes is up to the people who have the power to use it and to feed it fuel. If the people who own it use it and feed it fuel, keep handing it off to their identity and ideological heirs, nothing will ever change. Martin Luther King Jr. summed it up brilliantly when he said that, quote, "In a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by the nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention." End quote. I really can't complain about the orphans and puppies coming together to protest and oppose this home heating system I continue to use. In fact, if they burn the whole house to the ground with me in it, I can't say that would honestly be surprising. I said in my last episode that, quote, "There are people who want to say that identity politics is pure evil, but like any tool, it is what you make it. I'm not talking about quotas or simple proportionality. I'm talking about the people around you who are most often like you, who share your concerns, your struggles, your successes, and who see and understand the experience of their existence in much the same way you do. Bigots use identity politics to protect privilege. They claim they aren't using identity politics because they want to sell their reality as being built on merit and perks that they've earned. When I see pushback then against representation, especially when it comes in the form of a very shallow understanding of what that means, I know I'm dealing with someone who doesn't understand that simple proportionality is not what's being discussed. And it's not just a numbers game. Folks who view it as a quota system rather than an opportunity to increase diversity are a problem. Again, to recall something I said last episode, there's nothing stopping me from hiring a qualified minority or protected status applicant. Nothing. Saying the workforce has to be some percentage of women or non-white does not say that I have to hire unqualified candidates. But that's the assumption and the narrative that privileged people make. I follow a Twitter account for Nicholas Grossman. Recently he posted to say, quote, "Here's something important about meritocracy, something few acknowledge. There are often many more strong candidates than openings. And when picking between too many qualified candidates, she'll make our org more representative is a better tiebreaker than, say, I know his dad." It was also pointed out to me by someone who is intersectionally marginalized that folks who push back on representation and diversity often try to cover their bigoted motives by feigning that they're simply interested in choosing the best or most qualified candidate. I've heard that countless times. The best, the most qualified. And it drives a false assumption that there is exactly one person best or most qualified to do a job, when in fact there are many qualified applicants. Being able to understand the needs of more than one demographic is itself a qualification in the same way being bilingual makes you more of an asset to many companies. Certainly in any position where you're going to interact in a nation that touts itself as a melting pot, the more diversity you understand, the more of an asset you are when it comes to dealing with or serving the public good, or promoting the general welfare as our dishonest founders tried to portray it. They meant themselves. But hopefully today, we've rejected that notion and realized that a nation existing on a diverse planet is benefited the more they can understand and respond to those diverse needs. It should no longer be about exploiting the talent and labor of others, but about supporting them to help ensure their success. It's time to stop throwing people away and start nurturing their talents and recognizing their potential, to start questioning our foundational values and goals, even looking at being more flexible with our definition of success. Back in early 2015, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked when there will be enough women on the Supreme Court of the United States. She caused an uproar when she responded with, quote, "when there are 9, unquote. People with a superficial grasp of diversity were upset by this. People who understand it got what she was saying. SCOTUS has existed for almost 200 years, and in most of that time, the court was all men. And those who weren't represented were unable to seriously challenge that until very recently. The first woman on the court was put there during my lifetime. And after that, we've seen more." Ginsburg wasn't making a serious suggestion that men should be banned from serving on SCOTUS for all time. She was putting a knife into the heart of the bigoted hypocrisy of those who would be outraged to see all women represented within an institution that for almost 2 centuries banned women entirely and consisted only of men. What she was saying was basically, why don't we heat the homes of orphans and puppies with a new machine that uses the homeowner as fuel? The fact of the immediate outrage from people within a society that couldn't manage to be outraged about an all-male court for 200 years says that bigotry and bias are still embedded. Those who laughed and gave it a thumbs up know she wasn't suggesting that we heat the homes with anybody's bodies. Those who were outraged were the same people who excused the historic all-male court as if it wasn't nearly as outrageous that women should have to endure centuries of the same indignity they find utterly incomprehensible and intolerable for themselves. And that's the point. When the gun is aimed at them, it's an emergency. When it's aimed at others, well, those others need to be patient about it. They need to stay calm and civil about it. They need to empathize with their oppressors and consider their historic context. What they absolutely should not do is be outraged and express that outrage because we all need to calm down. Again, until the gun is aimed at their own heads, in which case suddenly it's time to be completely outraged. So taking my cue from Ginsburg, I replied to someone on a friend's page who wanted to say that the makeup of the court was shifting so much that we need to consider the representation of the white male on the court before they become a minority that is not fully represented. I replied with, how long was SCOTUS only white men? But having too many non-white or non-male justices is over-representation? For 192 years, there were all men on the court. Give us an all-woman SCOTUS for 192 years, and we'll call it even. I shared that status on my wall afterwards, and many people understood what I was saying. As my posts go, it was pretty popular with the like reacts. But the very first comment was a cishet white man who only said, "Really think this is illogical as hell." He didn't get it. I responded by explaining the post. I said, illogical is someone who owned the courts entirely for 192 years, counting how many non-white non-males are on there and complaining about not having enough representation. He's an oppressor crying about losing his privilege like he's being oppressed. If it's ridiculous to suggest that the courts should be all women for 192 years, imagine what it's like to be a woman and live in a country where for 192 years, until within your lifetime, it was considered to be reasonable for SCOTUS to be all men, where a man can complain about too many women on the court and think that's not entirely insulting and offensive. He accused me of strawmanning him and said no one said there shouldn't be women on the courts. But if you paid attention, he didn't actually provide a fleshed out position of his own for me to strawman. And what I said was merely an explanation of what I'd posted. I never claimed to represent what he was saying, and couldn't have, because he didn't actually provide his own position on the issue. just a one-line assessment of my original post. Since he claimed no one ever said that there shouldn't be women on the courts, I asked for clarification because it was difficult for me to believe anyone living in the US would suggest that. I provided a one-line reply saying, "So you're saying the nation was not opposed to women on SCOTUS?" Again, what I got back was a non sequitur and not a clarification or answer to my question. He wrote exactly one line saying, "Lots of people are upset about a lot of things." So I restated my question and asked, did this country bar women from the courts or not? I quoted the line I was responding to where he said, quote, "No one said that there shouldn't be women on the court," unquote. And I again asked, "I'm curious how you explain 192 years of an all-male SCOTUS if you don't believe anyone was opposed to women on SCOTUS." I then quoted his other line, "Lots of people are upset about a lot of things." And I added more clarification. Yes, women are upset that they've been barred from SCOTUS for 192 years. This white man I'm responding to is upset that they might not have enough representation in an institution they denied any representation to anyone else in for almost 200 years, while they thought that was completely fine. One group is upset about oppression, the other about losing privilege. And you're chiming in right away to support the oppressor. It's like I sit and eat a giant meal in front of people who aren't even allowed to have food while they watch and starve, and then 200 years later they're allowed to have some of the dessert, and I complain that they have a bigger piece of cake than I got. Women have suffered immense damage from non-representation since the beginning of the nation, and now they get some representation in some areas, and the very demographic who banned them wants to do a head count to make sure there isn't one woman too many in one area? That's some top-shelf hypocrisy. And that was where my comment ended. The exchange went on, but it didn't get much better. I think his core position can be reflected in the following paragraphs that are his own words. And this is basically the longest thing he added, the only substantial post that he made to explain his position. He said, "I never asked for or supported a non-representative court. I'd be more comfortable with critical thinkers and non-theists getting some representation. I think that would be a great approach to have representation of the people in this country. Palin is a woman, Bachmann is a woman, Marjorie Taylor Greene is a woman, Lauren Boebert is a woman. I think they would make shitty justices. You seem to be of the women are better than men because there are shitty men school. I just don't see that. I never once said I was against women on the court." Notice the sleight of hand there. It's true. He didn't say he was against women on the court. But that's not really the question. The question is whether you're in favor of women on the court. In other words, when you have a batch of great candidates before you and some bring diversity to the table, do you think that's worth considering in institutions that have a history of actively barring diversity? Or is it more important to you that you know his dad? Not only is someone from a marginalized community able to help us right a long-standing wrong, not only do they bring the value of increased diversity, but they also show that they were able to reach the level of a serious contender in a system set up to burn them to heat the house of the people they're competing with. The fact that they are even standing before you vying for the position as a strong top candidate shows capacity over and above the folks standing next to them who did not have to overcome those same obstacles. Literally nobody is asking us to compromise on the quality of the SCOTUS pick by giving stronger consideration to people who have been historically, willfully selected against. It's about asking us to consider the obligation we have to dismantle the machine and to recognize that the folks who know the most about the damage that machine does are those whose communities have been fed to it for centuries. Notice the framing, though, of my Facebook friend's comment. He says he doesn't support a non-representative court, just like he said he hasn't been against women on the court. He keeps avoiding proactive support for a diverse court, for women on the court. He's telling me what he's against, but not what he's for, or how he envisions making the courts more diverse and how to include more women if we don't actually select for them when it's time to choose a new SCOTUS judge. Notice when he does describe what he's proactively for, he says he'd be more comfortable with a critical thinker or non-theist being represented. More comfortable than what? Than a woman? Why wouldn't a person who's in favor of installing more women say they're glad to support a woman candidate and would be especially happy if she's a critical thinker and a non-theist? And as if his language were not enough of a giveaway, he then takes pains to name specific women in authority who are known for extreme and harmful views. Palin, Bachmann, Green, Boebert. Also note that the problem with all of these women is that they are members of the community that actually uphold the ideologies of their own oppressors, that they promote the continued propagation of white and male privilege. These women are women with a woman's experience, but they are, in essence, orphans and puppies who oppose dismantling the home heating system. So say that you don't oppose diversity, but then immediately point out that you prefer qualifications and diversity that includes things that aren't gender or race specific, and be sure to not go as far as to say that you agree it's important to nominate someone who can bring greater gender or race diversity to the court. Note that critical thinker and non-theist would do nothing to promote greater diversity for gender and race, even though he could support a black woman who is also a critical thinker and a non-theist. But he won't say that because he doesn't support that. Throughout the thread, not once does he provide any indication he takes oppression of women and non-whites seriously. Not once does he say that he actually wants Biden to proactively consider gender and race in choosing a candidate. And remember that for almost 200 years, we've lived in a nation where race and gender were requirements, not just preferences. Do we take that seriously? He wants to say he's not against a better world for orphans and puppies, but he can't name a single thing he's actually willing to do to give up power positions to them where they could potentially get their hands on real influence that could help them dismantle the heating system. I don't care if he's not against dismantling the machine. I'm asking if he's for it, and if there's anything he's willing to do to help make that a reality. I'm asking if he can even say the words out loud. Let's dismantle that machine by putting power in the hands of the orphans and the puppies instead of keeping them out of the house and using them as fuel. What is also interesting to me is that he tells me I think women are better than men because men are shitty. Something I never said nor insinuated. I simply think it's time to not just stop discriminating, but to take proactive steps to right the wrongs. I don't think not being against improving the world cuts it at this point. I want to hear you say that you're actually in favor of it, and to hear what you're doing about it, or what you're willing to do about it. Because if your solution is that we should keep installing different cishet white men and that that's as much as you're willing to support, then you're helping yourself, not people who have been traditionally barred from power positions. And as another person on the thread pointed out, he's ignoring a basic reality, that while you can find puppies and orphans who oppose empowering puppies and orphans, you're far more likely to find the strongest advocates for their empowerment among them, as opposed to among the people who are using that lethal heating system that requires the sacrifice of orphans and puppies to keep working. In his final comments, he told a black person on the thread that they weren't worthy to be communicating with him. I don't know if he was oblivious to the optics of that from a white man or if he just didn't care. But he consistently and continually insisted that we weren't understanding him, that we were twisting his words. But most of us were including direct quotes from him in our replies, and most of us were simply clarifying the position of the OP and not his position. I find that pretty often people who are misunderstood by a lot of diverse people on a thread are simply unwilling to step into other people's shoes and try and hear what they sound like to those they're talking to, who come from a different experience. Especially in a case where I'm in the dominant culture, it's very unlikely that the people I'm talking to aren't familiar with those narratives. That's actually why it's the dominant culture, because it's the culture that owns the system and the narratives. It's the perspectives that we can't escape from because they pervade everywhere in the culture. That's what makes them dominant. So it takes a lot of audacity for me as a white person to assume that a black person raised in the US doesn't know what white people think about something, what the white cultural narratives are and what they mean. But also as a white person, I need to slow down and pay attention when someone who isn't white is telling me something, because the odds are pretty high that I haven't heard it before, or that if I have, I've heard some whitewashed straw man version of it, or consider that whatever narrative I've been fed about it is a talking point intended to get me to unwittingly support a racist system. Black perspectives, for example, just don't get platformed as much. And when they do, it's usually not in a space where they're talking about racism issues where loads of white people are in the audience. People need to make room at the table. Not just do nothing to stop new people from sitting at the table, but actively step back so that someone else can have a seat. Or bring in more chairs, or whatever it takes. But it takes motivation and action based on understanding the community needs, which takes listening and humility. Before unfriending me, he said that the confusion in part was due to me not including the comment that I was responding to in the OP. So here's what I finished with. Does it even enter your mind that you're the only person who didn't understand the image? Then I quote him, "Put the graphic up and there would be no confusion." I respond, "Is it really that the image was confusing? Or is it that you aren't really up to speed on this issue enough to understand the image? There was no graphic. I think the comment I'm responding to is implied in the response I posted, just as, 'Hey, want to go to the movies?' includes an implication that I'm asking you, even if 'do you' is missing and isn't explicitly stated. What you're doing here is the equivalent of saying, 'How can I possibly know you're talking to me? You're inviting me to the movie,' which might be true if you weren't a native English speaker. But I'm not posting for people who have no comprehension of social justice and who can't take oppression seriously enough to educate themselves about it. I expect a certain level of savvy on these issues, and if you don't have it, then maybe you shouldn't be the first one commenting on the thread. Maybe do more reading from those who do grasp it to see what you're not appreciating and understanding. When you say basically, 'We don't need more women on the court, we need more critical thinkers regardless of gender,' I know you think that's a perfectly reasonable statement because you've never existed in a system where cishet white male meant you were born presumed to be incapable of serving as a judge on SCOTUS just by being born into that identity. Centuries of this system have reinforced in you that you were born with a presumption of being capable. Try to consider what it feels like to be in a demographic where you know that you have been presumed to be incapable of serving in any formal serious power position since the inception of the nation, so much so that you've never seen anyone in your demographic elected as president and only rarely as a candidate. And this presumption stems from the identity into which you were simply born. Try imagining that in your adult lifetime was the first time anyone from your demographic was even put on the court in almost 200 years, and you still aren't considered capable of being a president or serving in the U.S. Congress because there you are grossly underrepresented. Consider that your audience includes a lot of people who, unlike you, have been told repeatedly that they can't do the job because of their race or their gender, and then think about how it sounds when you say that rather than focus on identity, we should focus on capacity. In a society where only one gender and one race is considered to be born with that requisite capacity for power positions, that's easy for you to hear as a fair statement. Try being born outside that gender or race, in a situation where you're reminded every day that you aren't taken seriously as a contender due to your identity, where you are considered to not have requisite capacity because you aren't assigned male at birth or white, or hearing someone suggest that it should be about critical thought rather than gender or race or whatever other category that this society shits on by reminding us that they don't believe we have any capacity to serve in any way that would allow us any influence over the society to substantially change that construct. You do not consider how you're propping up bigotry and how you sound to people on the receiving end of it. You literally benefit from living in a society that is tailor-made for you in so many ways, and that due to that same structure does not accommodate others. And then you suggest that those who aren't accommodated should try to act like we get a fair shake when we absolutely do not. This might help if you even want to try to understand. And beneath that line, I posted a video resource that I'm going to post in the description. He replied again to say, "I didn't say all that. Your bias is reinterpreting the English language, but of course, it's always easier to put words in someone else's mouth than to make any effort to understand. He then had to be sure to invalidate not just me, but every other person who had engaged him on the thread to try and offer clarity. He said, "Actually, I think that a group of sycophants is willing to assume the worst about me, ignore everything I and you said, and see your views in the most charitable way possible. In my opinion, this is where you have slid into the ditch. No need to respond. I sadly don't think there's anything of value here." And that was all he had to say. I want to note that every person who was not me on that thread has either taught me things or had heated disagreements with me on my own wall. If they are sycophants, they're a variety of sycophant who is not afraid to stand up to me and speak their minds. They aren't shy about disagreeing with me or even getting angry at me. And we don't always arrive at an agreement. The two hottest conversations I had with people on that thread ended without resolution. Nobody changed their minds, but we're still all there in that space. To me, those are peers, not sycophants. But by labeling them as people who are just going to agree with Tracy in Tracy's space, he can dismiss them all as insincere followers. To me, this was the most hurtful thing said on the thread because it impacted many marginalized people who had a lot to offer and who took the time and did the work to try and help this person understand. To reach back to an earlier analogy, these were people who don't have a lot of money who were throwing $100 bills at a guy who ultimately decided to just set fire to the money and walk away. As one person on the thread put it, "It's not about assuming the worst about you. It's about the impact of your words on others, which you don't seem to care about. People from demographics outside your own, with experience outside your own, are trying to tell you something, and you're too defensive to hear it. You mistakenly think that you're being attacked. You're so convinced that you've been misunderstood that you fail to realize no one put words in your mouth, and yet you're unwittingly doing damage." Another person signed off with this: "Every single person here has read your words the exact same way. And then in response, you do nothing but reinforce that reading. If you truly believe that you're being misunderstood, at the very least, you need to take a long look at why you're so very bad at expressing yourself. But that's not the case, and everybody here knows that. You've said what you said, and we're responding to that." And that was the end of his comment. I think for me, that's the thing, that he's hearing people from all walks of life responding to him and saying, "Here's how your words impact me." And rather than take that to heart and try to understand what these people are saying, his response is to believe not a single person in the conversation is hearing what he's actually saying, and then invent a story about them all simply being unthinking supporters of me, even though it's they who teach me every day. And that's how he explains to himself that all of these people are misunderstanding him in the exact same way. Beyond what I've already read that he said, literally, the rest of his contribution to the thread was to keep repeating that nobody was understanding. He wasn't posting clarifications or restatements. He posted what I've shared here in this podcast. There was no point in the thread where he said he absolutely supports proactively choosing a candidate from a protected class or marginalized community. There was no point where he listed competent contenders from those communities in the same way he'd portrayed them with Palin, Bachmann, Green, and Boebert. His message was the dominant culture narrative of, quote, "I want the most qualified candidate regardless of identity," which is the calling card of the person who isn't all that committed to dismantling the heating system for reasons described earlier. We have no hope of changing a system when the people who benefit from it won't do what it takes to make room for those who pay the cost to provide them with those benefits. When I can't do the bare minimum, when I can't even be bothered to eat food that is being spoon-fed to me, then I'm dedicated to that system and to the harm that it does in service to me. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring life in the cottage at Woodland Corners. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.